Well, it's a great pleasure to be back again with you this morning. I want to extend a thanks to the Sesson and to Kevin in particular for inviting me to give these talks this weekend. It's been a real pleasure. It's great also to have a green room where there are Tostitos and Mountain Dew, I noticed, in full supply. So a bit early in the day for me for either of those things. I talked last night about really about how technology has reshaped how we think about what it means to be a human being. We could step back from that a little and look and summarize in some ways what I said in this way. That technology has increasingly empowered the human impatience with external authority. And it has also enabled us to imagine our bodies as things that are a hindrance to us, a hindrance to who we are. And I ended last night, at least the expository section of what I was saying, by talking about transhumanism. And I made the point that transgenderism is a species of transhumanism. Transhumanism is this broad collection of philosophies or ambitions that sees the human body and its limitations as something to be overcome by the use of technological means. And transgenderism is a specific form of that. I want to start this morning by reflecting just a few moments on why I myself got involved in this question in order to highlight its importance, I think, for everybody here. It was in 2016 that I received an email one evening out of the blue from the husband of the person who'd been my kids' favorite teacher at the local high school. My two boys went through the public school system in a suburb just outside Philadelphia, and they particularly appreciated the teaching of the history teacher there. And her husband dropped me a line to say that the school board were about to bring transgender policies into play within the school district. My boys had long graduated by this point. It was 2016. I was no longer connected to the school in any formal way. But the husband of this teacher was asking me if I'd be willing to draft a letter with him. He was a lawyer. If I would draft a letter with him and send it to the school board in order to challenge what was being done on the quiet. I believe we were the first school district in Pennsylvania to pass bathroom, sports, etc. policies relative to transgender issues. The twist in the story was, because his wife was still employed at the school, only my name would appear on the letter. So only my house would be firebombed, etc., that kind of thing. Well, I thought for about 3 nanoseconds and realized, I have to do this. So he and I drafted a letter. You can actually find it. I later posted it on the First Things website. We drafted a letter to the school board. I sent it in to the school board. I knew the chairman of the school board, and she sent me a very polite and friendly response. I sent it to the local newspaper, trying to see if I could stir up some trouble there, if they would, highlight me on the front page as local bigot or something like this, in order to draw attention to the issue. They weren't interested. So I got a couple in my church. I don't do social media myself. I got a couple in my church to post it on their Facebook page. And I asked them what the response had been. And the response deeply disturbed me. The response from the parents in the area to this that they'd received on their Facebook page was that none of them could see the problem. None of them could understand that this issue, the transgender issue, was going to be qualitatively different to the other issues that were coming into play at that point. This issue was going to affect everything, particularly women's safety and women's private spaces. And I remember that quotation of Trotsky floating around in my head. You may not be interested in the revolution, but the revolution is interested in you. You may not be interested in transgenderism, but transgenderism is interested in you. It is going to affect the spaces that women operate in. It is going to affect wives, mothers, daughters, granddaughters, grandmothers. And that was really the moment at which I became sort of radicalized on the issue and decided I needed to try to spend time coming to grips with what was going on. A lot of Christians spend their time bashing other Christians. I decided, no, now's the time I need to focus my attention on the real enemy out there. And I became convinced that transgenderism was really the latest iteration of something that's been going on for a long time in Western culture, and that is the use of technology to rebel against external authority, the exaltation, if you like, of the human will. And the question arises then, well, how do you press back against this? It's one thing to analyze the problem, see where it comes from, look at the various facets of the issue. The big issue for us is, how do we press back against it? How do we teach our children to think about this thing so that the world that they're growing up in is one that is not mysterious to them and one where they know why it's wrong and how they should respond? And I became convinced that the heart of that issue, at the heart of that response, has to lie two things. One, we need to understand that bodies are important. And two, we need to understand that the sexed nature of our bodies as men and women is important. Now, before I go on to offer my sort of analysis this morning, I want to say one thing up front, and that is I'm going to offer a theoretical approach here. In doing so, I do not wish to diminish or trivialize the suffering of those who are struggling with gender dysphoria. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I've spoken to a number of such people, and I've spoken to many, many families that have been touched or torn apart by this. When you talk to a parent whose child has transitioned, it's as if you're talking to a parent whose child has died. That's the impression I get. I have no experience of the death of a child in my family and no experience of gender transition in my family. But the impression I get from talking to these families, it's heartbreaking. It's as if they have been bereaved. So, while I'm going to set forth this morning a kind of fairly objective, somewhat dispassionate, certainly not very emotional. Hey, Jonathan will understand this. I'm English. I'm sort of emotionally two-dimensional. You don't get much emotion from me anyway. While I set forward a fairly sort of objective account, please don't read that as lack of pastoral concern for individuals struggling with this. My focus this morning, if you like, is on the social philosophy that underlies this, not the individuals who have been torn apart and seriously damaged by this. So, with the pastoral prologue out of the way then, where should we go with this? Well, first thing I want to point out is transgenderism operates with a basic distinction. A basic distinction between what most of us would call biological sex and gender identity. Now, if you read gender theorists, I don't recommend that you read gender theorists, but if you do wade through their gobbledygook, you will find that many of them actually see biology as what we might call a social construct. What do they mean by that? Well, they certainly don't mean to say that human beings can reproduce with other species, and the fact we can't reproduce with other species is just a social convention or an invention. They would acknowledge certain, we might say, physical realities. What they question is this: the way those physical realities have been given an authority as a way of dividing up the human race. So if a gender theorist like Judith Butler was on stage with me today, I suspect she would challenge me by saying something like this: why is it that you use these particular aspects of bodily physiology to divide up the human race? Why don't you divide up the human race between redheads and the rest, between gingers and everybody else? What you have done is you have mapped, you have imposed, you have connected a certain set of behavioral expectations to certain physical characteristics. And you've done that in order to serve certain interests of power, manipulation, that kind of thing. So they would question even that distinction that I'm making between biological sex and gender. I think most of us, if not all of us in this room, probably accept that biology is important and that it should ground our notion of gender. Transgender theorists will question or deny that. So how might we respond? Well, I think the first aspect of response is this. We need to emphasize that the body is the person. The body is the person. Now, I suspect even in Christian circles, we might actually imagine who we are in a way that doesn't do full justice to that. Christians make a distinction between body and soul. I think it is a biblical distinction. The distinction between body and soul is an important one. It is grounded, I believe, in scriptural teaching. The danger of that is that it can tilt us towards thinking that the soul is the real us and the body is something attached to the real us or something that we inhabit. You've probably seen videos of spacemen. We're all familiar with spacemen. And there they are floating around in space or landing on the moon, taking one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. And that's Neil Armstrong, and he's inside a spacesuit. The spacesuit is not Neil Armstrong. The spacesuit is the thing he inhabits in order to be able to walk on the surface of the moon. I think in the Christian world, sometimes we can think of the person, the human person, as a bit like that. We are our souls, and our souls kind of inhabit our bodies. That's a faulty way of thinking. Now, you might immediately respond and say, but surely when I die, my soul goes to be with the Lord. Does the Lord not say to the second thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise? Absolutely. As I say, I fully accept the distinction. But I'm also intrigued or challenged by a comment that the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas makes about what happens when you die. He makes a statement to the effect that when you die, your soul will go to be with the Lord. But then he qualifies that and he says, but it is not you. It is not you. It is not you until your soul is reunited with matter, with your body, on the day of resurrection. Then it is fully you. And I think that's an important qualification. It's an important qualification because it reminds us that we are not just a soul. We are a soul and a body. And I think the Bible presses the importance of the body many, many times. Think about Adam and Eve. Adam is made as a body. Eve is made as a body from his body. When Adam first sees her, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. There's something ineradicably fleshy and bodily about Adam and Eve. Think about the teaching about the resurrection. The gospel ultimately is not merely forgiveness of sins. The gospel is forgiveness of sins culminating in resurrection and newness of life. And that has a profound bodily quality to it, does it not? The story is not over until we are bodily resurrected. It is not enough, we might say with Aquinas, for our souls to be present with the Lord. Things aren't truly brought to an end until our bodies, united to our souls, are present with the Lord. Bodies are important. We are taught in the Bible that we are embodied persons. And think about that, our own common use of language indicates this. When I leave for work in the morning, I could say to you, I use my face to suck my wife's face. You laugh. Why do you laugh? That's an accurate physical account of what goes on. I kiss my wife. But it's a weird way of putting it. Why? Because it is not my face touching my wife's face. It is me kissing my wife. It is my person coming into contact with her person. I actually think the face is crucially important to personhood as well. That would be another lecture. But think about that. When you look at somebody and they smile at you, you don't say, "Oh, Dave's face is smiling at me." You say, "Dave is smiling at me." Because we intuitively know that the person of Dave and the smiling face are one and the same thing. One and the same thing. Bodies are important. Even our common sense language indicates that. Why do I introduce that sort of common sense argument? Well, I think we live in an era where so many basic ideas are being so fundamentally challenged. It's actually helpful to have subsidiary arguments to strengthen the biblical ones. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the Bible is insufficient for teaching. What I am saying is, it's very useful to be able to point people to the fact that the Bible teaches this. Oh, and by the way, the way you live your life, or the way you intuitively think about things, shows that the Bible makes sense. We spend a lot of time at college with students, and several times a year a student will come into my office and say, "What does the Bible teach about homosexuality?" And I can point them to the Bible verses. One thing I've noticed, though, with the rising generation is this. They'll accept the Bible verses, but at the back of their minds, I know the question of, but why does the Bible say that? Is it just because God wants my gay friends to be miserable? Is rattling away at the back of their minds. And in that context, I found it useful to point my students to some of the medical statistics, for example, that cluster around men who engage in an active gay homosexual lifestyle. So, by the way, and if you do indulge in this, look at the damage you do to your body. The Bible teaches this, and guess what? Nature is patterned along those lines as well. So I think that these arguments from what we might call intuitional common sense, they're not decisive, but I think they really help. They really help strengthen the Bible's case for the rising generation of young Christians. So we have the intuitive use of language. We have, when I say somebody smiles at me, it's Dave smiling at me. We acknowledge that the face is the person and not merely an instrument. So the first thing then, first aspect, I think, of Christian thinking about transgenderism, we need to realize the body is the person. There is no spooky entity floating around within the body that is the real person. Essentially what that means is this: you cannot be born in the wrong body. There is no you to be born in the wrong body. You are your body. And to go back to an illustration I used last night, if you think you're a woman trapped in a man's body, that's a problem of the mind, not of the body. There is no you floating around in your body like an astronaut floats around inside a space suit. An astronaut may well put on the wrong suit. A human being does not put on the wrong body. How deeply this notion of bodies and minds being separated in modern culture can be seen if you look at the amicus brief filed in the Dobbs abortion case. Dobbs was the case, many of you will know, that led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Amicus brief was filed in that case. Amicus briefs are briefs, supporting briefs filed by parties not directly involved in the legal action, but to offer arguments or support for one side or the other. There was an amicus brief filed by the professional women athletes of the United States. It's worth reading. I'm not a lawyer, not able to parse the legal jargon. What interested me was the way these women athletes talked about their bodies. They talked about their bodies as a carpenter might talk about a drill, or I might talk about a book, or a banker might talk about money. They talked about their bodies as if they were tools of the trade and not actually them. It is quite eerie looking at the language they use about their bodies. There is a distance between who they are and what their bodies are. That shows how much this basic separation between identity and embodiment has embedded itself in our culture. So the first thing then, bodies are important. Secondly, sexual activity has peculiar status. And you can see where I'm going with this. I'm going to argue that sexual activity has peculiar status, and therefore the sex nature of bodies has peculiar status. Adam and Eve. There is no companion suitable for Adam prior to the creation of Eve. Once Eve has been created, well, Adam is no longer lonely, and the two become one flesh. The bodies are important, but there is a complementarity in the bodies there that is signally important for who Adam and Eve are. It's brought out beautifully in Milton's Paradise Lost. I do not recommend Milton's Paradise Lost as a source for systematic theology, by the way. I do recommend it as one of the pinnacles of religious English literature. Well, one of the pinnacles of English literature, period. The passage dealing with the creation of Eve, where Adam first sets his eyes upon Eve, is one of the most beautiful and romantic, I think, in the entire English language. And no sooner has Adam seen Eve in that way than they run off into the bushes to make love to each other. Sexual activity, very important to the identity of Adam and Eve. Then when we turn to the Old Testament, think about the Old Testament law. A disproportionate amount of Old Testament law is preoccupied with two things: sex and death. The uncleanness or the cleanness that stems from the former in various contexts, the uncleanness that surrounds the latter. It's interesting, of course, that both sex and death are very bodily. I've joked before, it doesn't matter how much you self-identify as immortal, one day your body will have the final word. Your body will prove its authority on that issue, even if you think you can trick it or con it on the gender issue. The Old Testament law is very preoccupied with sex and death. That tells me, one, bodies are very important. They have a sacred significance, we might say. And two, it tells me that sex is very important as well. And interestingly enough, that's not unique to the Jewish or the Christian religion. I contacted recently a Muslim friend and asked him about Muslim treatment of sex and death in the Quran and in Islamic law. And he said, yeah, cleanness and impurity. Special washings for the man who's had sexual relations with his wife before he goes to prayer. Not just the feet, the hands and the lower arms and the face. The whole body has to be washed. There seems to be deep within the religious soul of human beings an understanding that sex is important. And why should it not be so? It is in some ways the most godlike function, is it not, of human beings. We are at our most godlike when we create new life. So, sexual activity has peculiar status in the Old Testament. Always intrigued by that statement of Paul, where he's addressing the Corinthian church, which of course is a bit of a hotbed of sexual immorality. And he makes that comment about, the man who has joined his body with that of a prostitute has committed a peculiarly heinous sin. Now we know that Paul holds to the fact that, if you've broken the law at one point, you've broken it at every point. But he singles that sin out for particular excoriation. I might put it this way. A man who does that has defiled his own body. He's desecrated his own body. The sexual nature of the body connects to the body's sacred status in some deep and profound way. And of course, it has to be significant that the union of man and woman in marriage is the analog for the union between Christ and his church. The sacred nature of the marriage union is the closest analog to that sacred union between Christ and his church. Some years ago, a friend of mine, Francesca Murphy, we were colleagues at the University of Aberdeen in the late 90s, and she's now at Notre Dame. And she wrote an article, I think it was for First Things, on gay marriage. It was in the run-up to the Obergefell decision. And I'd never seen gay marriage described this way before. She referred to gay marriage as blasphemous. And it really took me back. That was very strong language. And I was thinking, well, that makes sense from a Catholic perspective, particularly where marriage has this sacramental dimension. But it also sort of makes sense from a Protestant, biblical perspective. If marriage between a man and a woman is the analog of the union of Christ in his church, then the mockery of that analog, be it gay marriage, be it no-fault divorce, has a blasphemous quality to it. It is a desecration. Again, pointing to the importance of sexual activity. That brings us then, we can move then from this sacred nature of sex and the importance of embodiment to, I would say, the sacred nature of the sex nature of the body. We already cited Paul on that front. And bodies, of course, will be presented as living sacrifices. Paul sees the Christian's body as an arena of the sacred. But I think this is deeply embedded in what it means to be a human anyway. I'm going to make another of those, not exactly a common sense argument, but I want you to reflect upon how even our culture acknowledges the importance of the sex nature of the body, even as it denies it. It's just one of the many contradictions that exists within a culture that denies the external authority of God. First of all, I think human culture indicates quite clearly that we understand that the erotic sexual desire is very important. There is a reason why we read the Iliad today, and it makes sense. You know, what's the Iliad? It's a story about, well, one guy falls in love with another guy's wife, runs off with her, the guy who's been jilted gets together with his brother, puts together an army, and goes off to Troy to retrieve her. We read that today and it resonates. Why? We are not Greek heroes. We are not Greek gods. They do not populate our land. They do not populate our imagination. But we understand the nature of erotic and sexual betrayal. I jokingly say to the students when I talk about this at Grove, I say, the Iliad, it's the plot of every American soap opera, every lunchtime. It is, isn't it? Every soap opera tends to revolve around tales of sexual betrayal. It is a hardy perennial. We read the story of Lancelot and Guinevere in the great medieval Arthurian epics, and we understand what's going on because our world is populated with similar, albeit more mediocre and low-level betrayals that we can understand. We read Shakespeare's Othello, and we understand what's going on because we know about sexual jealousy. We read Anna Karenina, and it makes sense. I also, when I mention Anna Karenina is interesting, isn't it? I remember a few years ago, the BBC said they were producing a version of Anna Karenina and they were updating it. And if you don't know the story is one of where Anna Karenina, she's married to a decent but boring man, Karenin. She falls in love with a dashing soldier, Vronsky. But of course, she can't divorce him. It's 19th century Russia. So, spoiler alert, she ends up killing herself. I remember pointing to the students and saying, you can't update that. Because today, she'd just get divorced and run off with Vronsky. That's how much sexual mores have changed. So you can't update the story, but you can still sympathize with the dynamics of the action. We still know, perhaps friends or relatives who've been betrayed or who have betrayed people in that way. And it resonates with us. So we understand that sex is important. It's not cheap, as the sexual revolution attempts to tell us. We know that it hurts and harms people because we can resonate with the power and the pungency of sexual betrayal. Our society still acknowledges that, thankfully. Sex crimes sex crimes carry escalated penalties before the law. Why? Because for all of the nonsense talked about sex being merely a recreational, contractual thing, we know that if somebody is assaulted in some ways, it is far more significant than being assaulted in other ways. Well, I can tell a personal story. I'll give you the details some other time, but I was held at gunpoint by a member, apparently it seems to be a member of the Nigerian mafia, for about 20 minutes about 2 months ago, threatening to blow my brains out. I'd accidentally arrived on the driveway of a Nigerian mafia house in Texas and upset the inhabitants. It was kind of a relief when the police arrived and the whole thing got de-escalated and I was able to see my wife again. Lord's providence, it's the one trip I've made in the last 8 months where my wife wasn't with me. I suspect she would have coped psychologically less well than I did, because within 15 minutes of it all being over, I was sitting with a friend. He had poured me a large glass of Whistle Pig 15, which is about $500 a bottle, I think. So it was a nice reward. And I was joking about it. It had become, he said, "I'm terribly sorry that was your experience in my neighborhood." And I said, "Oh, don't be sorry." I said, "I'm going to be telling this story for the rest of my life." You know? And on the Monday, I just dropped it out in class. I said to the students, "Oh, by the way, remind me to tell you about how on Friday night I was held at gunpoint for 20 minutes by a guy threatening to kill me." And then I carried on with the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, nobody moved. And a hand goes up and a student says, "Dr. Trueman, you really have to tell us that story now." But I can laugh about that. My guess is if I'd been sexually assaulted that night, I would not laugh about it. I would probably not tell anybody about it, because it would carry not just a shame and a stigma, but a psychological blow to me like nothing else. Anybody who's been a pastor for any length of time knows that people damaged by sexual sin, whether their own or those of other people, are the most difficult pastoral cases to deal with. Frank Beckwith, the great professor of law at Baylor University, wrote a remarkable essay a couple of years ago, and I'm going to summarize it for you here because I think he brings out in this essay, like nobody else, the special cachet that applies to sexual activity. Frank, in this essay, engages in an interesting thought experiment. He raises the Harvey Weinstein issue. We're probably all familiar with Harvey Weinstein, the movie mogul who fell from grace because he was exchanging parts in movies for sexual favors given to him by young women wanting to get their first break in the movies. And Frank engages in a thought experiment to expose what's really going on and why we really think that Weinstein is a monster. He says, imagine this scenario. If you ask your students, what's the problem? What's the problem with Weinstein? They'll come up with something like this. They'll say, Weinstein was forcing young women to do something they didn't want to do for his own sexual gratification. And that sounds like a reasonable account of what's gone on. But Frank then goes on to argue, but that doesn't really get at it. Imagine this scenario, he says. Imagine a scenario where Weinstein's wife is too tired of an evening typically to make love to him because she's having to cook him dinner. Imagine if Weinstein was saying to these young women, I'll give you a part in my movie, but you've got to cook me dinner every night so that my wife will have the energy to make love to me when we go to bed. What's going on there? Well, Frank would say, he's forcing young women to do something they don't want to do for his own sexual gratification. Is he a monster? Well, I think the intuitive answer most of us would give is, no, he's a creep. He's a bully and he's a creep, but he's not a monster. He's not destroying these young girls' lives. He's just forcing them to do something they don't want to do. So Frank would say, okay, let's up the ante a bit. So what is the problem? He said the student may well respond, well, the problem is that the body is being invaded in some way. It's that invasion of the body that's the problem. So Frank says, think about a second scenario. Again, Harvey Weinstein. And he's offering parts in movies to these beautiful young aspiring actresses on condition that they allow him to lick his finger and stick it in their ear. He says, what would we think of him then? Well, we'd think he's a creep. We might even think he's a weird creep at this point. But would we think he's the monster that he is? And Frank's argument is no. We think he's a creep. Is it worthy of jail time? Probably not. Might be worthy of counseling, maybe probation, but probably not worthy of jail time. And yet the body's been invaded. So that leads Frank then to the third scenario, the real scenario. And he says, so what is it about the real scenario that makes Weinstein so monstrous? It is the fact that the invasion of the body is a sexual invasion of the body. That sexual constitution of the body is critical. Now, I'm not sure, I can't remember if Frank goes on to say this, but I would then come back and say, so what is going on then in this? Why is this sexual invasion of the body so critical, so devastating? Well, I would put it in this way. Because the sex nature of the body is essential to who you are. Go back to my first point. We are our bodies, we are our sex bodies. And that means that the sexual use of our bodies, building off Paul, of course, who says this is very, very important, the sexual use of our bodies is not like other uses of our bodies. It goes deeper to the heart of the self than anything else. And I would want to say, if you say, so Trueman, why is sexual assault much, much worse than being held up by some Nigerian gangster for 20 minutes? I would say this. Because sexual assault takes from somebody that which only they can freely give. What does it take from you? What does it take from the victim of sexual assault? I would say it takes their very self. That's what makes it so destructive. And that also highlights the fact that the sex nature of our bodies is critically important to who we are. It is not negotiable. Our bodies are not something we inhabit, like some spooky, ethereal presence, like a man in a spacesuit. Our sex bodies are not things we inhabit as some sort of separable, spooky presence. They are us. And society's intuitive understanding that sexual assault is particularly heinous reflects that. And we see that, you don't have to go to the New Testament for that. Think of Paul think of David, the rebellion of his son against David. How does the son mark his rebellion against David? He sets up his tent on the roof of the palace, and he has David's concubines and wives brought to him so that he can sleep with them. He's taking something that should only be given freely by them to David. That's what makes it so heinous. So, when you put together all that I've said so far, we might say this: the self is embodied, the self is sexed, and that is of deep importance to who we are. Deep importance. Now, let's think about what transgenderism as a way of thinking is claiming. Again, as I said at the start, I do not wish to belittle the struggles of anybody for whom this is their issue, and the pain that that is causing either to them as an individual or to the families who are seeking to help and support them. What does transgenderism assume? Well, in some ways it assumes something that has been at the heart of radical and liberal feminism for well over a generation. Radical and liberal feminism essentially see, I alluded to this last night, the biological differences between men and women as unfair. The fact that a woman has periods, the fact that a woman can get pregnant is unfair. And we must use either law, as with liberal feminism, or technology, with the more radical feminist strands, to equalize the playing ground. What does that involve? A war on the body. A war on the sex nature of the woman's body. So transgenderism emerges in a culture, if you like, where we've already been schooled to think that the biological differences between men and women are fundamentally unfair to women. Secondly, why is transgenderism gained kind of plausibility. It's one thing for crazy people in university seminars to buy into this stuff. Why is it that even ordinary men and women in the street now are struggling to answer the question, what is a woman? Well, I think gender theory, like all heresies within the church, has plausibility because it does articulate something of the truth. If Judith Butler were here, we would say to Judith Butler, probably the preeminent gender theorist, what is gender? She'd say it's a performance. It's a set of performances that are arbitrarily mapped onto biological constitution of human beings. She probably wouldn't like the language of biology there, but gender is a performance. Well, there's truth to that. One of my big hesitations about certainly the more hardcore elements of the biblical manhood and womanhood movement has been we need to be careful just how much of our cultural understanding of what it means to be a man and a woman we essentialize. Growing up in Britain in the 1970s and 80s, the vision of manhood, such as it was, we never talked in those terms, but the vision of what it was to be a man was very, very different to that which somebody growing up in the 70s and 80s in America would have had. South Korea would be different again. Masculinity in Britain in the 1970s and 80s really meant emotional reserve, self-control, making a joke about serious and dangerous stuff. Hey, you're held up by a Nigerian gangster? Have a laugh about it. Don't try to shoot the guy. I'm probably the only unarmed man, by the way, within a 50-mile radius of West in Pennsylvania. Guns don't feature in my understanding of what it means to be a man. They do in American understandings of that. Now, that's not to say that my view is right and the American view is wrong. It's to point to the fact that an awful lot of what we associate with being men and women is actually socially generated. It's a performance based on the context and society in which we live. And to the extent that Judith Butler agrees with that, to that extent, her thinking's plausible. What she does, of course, as with all heresies, she will extend that to exclude everything else. Not what's wrong with Arianism. Arianism is not wrong in positing a distinction between the Father and the Son in the doctrine of the Trinity. Arianism is wrong because it makes that distinction the only important thing to which everything else must be subordinated, and ends up really denying the full deity of the Son. Arianism is plausible because it grabs hold of a bit of the truth and then excludes all other truths on the basis of that. John Henry Newman, the great Anglican and then Roman Catholic theologian, made the comment that all heresies are a truth pushed to the extreme to the exclusion of all other truths. Gender theory is plausible because, people do this. Actually, we used to think that only men could do this job. Now men and women do it, and they seem to do it quite well. Thirdly, that truth is rendered more plausible by technology. That's what I was talking about last night. What Marxists call the division of labor, how you chop up the workplace, or the work that has to be done in society, has been transformed by technology. In the past, blacksmiths had to be big, burly guys. Generally speaking, blacksmiths were going to be men. Generally speaking, knights in shining armor were going to be men. Joan of Arc is a notable exception, of course. But by and large, physical strength played into the way society organized itself in terms of its work, its division of labor. That no longer applies with the advent of technology. It doesn't take much to fly a drone. If bombs are dropped from drones, does it really matter whether it's a man or a woman operating the controls back in Washington? Warfare no longer favors physical strength in the way that it once did. And that makes gender theory even more plausible. And then when you add to that the idea of hormone treatment, gender transition surgery, you really do move into that world that Mary Harrington, who I quoted last night, talks about human beings as being meat Lego. if you lose sight of the fact that we are our bodies and the sex nature of our bodies is fundamental to who we are, it is very easy for technology to sweep you away and think that the difference between men and women is merely a technological problem that can and will be overcome. What are the dangers? What are the dangers of losing sight of the importance of the body? What are the things that as parents and grandparents we should be watching out for in the light of what I've said? Number of things. One, I think it's very interesting. The body is becoming less important also in the understanding of parenthood. There's a whole talk I could give on IVF, cloning, etc., on that front. But you don't have to look to science to see how that's developing. My friend Helen Alvarez at the Scalia Law School in Washington has done a lot of work on parental rights and makes the point in several places that parental rights under law in the United States are shifting in what would be called a functional direction. Once upon a time, a parent was a biological phenomenon, a bodily thing. I am the parent of my sons because of a physical, bodily connection and history. American law is shifting to seeing parents as fulfilling functions. The most dramatic example of this was the California bill that recently failed, thanks to Gavin Newsom, who's presumably preparing for a presidential bid, I guess, as he's suddenly becoming a little more conservative on things. The bill that would say affirmation of a child's gender identity was effectively a condition of being a parent. That's a functional view of parenting that's emerging there. Notice I use that term parenting. When did parenting become a verb? I don't know, but that's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? When I was growing up, I'm pretty sure parent was just a noun. Now it's a verb. Now it's an activity. Secondly, I think, make no mistake, the way that gender transition is being pushed for young people represents state-sanctioned child abuse. One of the things I did not anticipate in 2016, when I started to read a lot in this subject and started to get involved, was this. I did not anticipate that the big problem would be among young, teenage, adolescent girls. I did not see that coming. I assumed it would be a confused male problem predominantly, because that is how it had presented itself. It is interesting, isn't it? This is not the first point in history that young women going through puberty have been very uncomfortable in their bodies. It is the first point in history where the medical establishment and the government are in lockstep to promote that discomfort. In the 80s and 90s, we had anorexia and bulimia. They are the analog for rapid onset gender dysphoria. When does rapid onset gender dysphoria start? It really takes off in 2015. What else happens in 2015? Social media becomes a real thing in 2015. My colleague, Mary Rice Hassan, at the Ethics and Public Policy Center has done wonderful work tracing the rise of rapid onset gender dysphoria relative to other sociological phenomena. We're raising a generation of girls and telling them that their natural discomfort with their bodies has to be understood through the lens of gender theory. What does that mean? We live in an era of, I would describe it as horrific, government-sanctioned child abuse. That's what it is. We should call it by its name. Thirdly, I think it's misogynistic when you deny the significance of the body, specifically when you regard the female body as a problem. You're a misogynist. You may be the most radical feminist out there, but you hate women. You are a misogynist. And that, I think, has to be part and parcel of how we think about pronouns. Now, I've got good Christian friends with whom I disagree on the use of pronouns. But I would say this: if you use somebody's preferred pronouns that do not correlate with their biological gender, you're a misogynist. We tend to only think of the person in front of us. Should I use this man who's claiming to be a woman? Should I use his preferred female pronouns? And in some ways, it's a good instinct to want to be caring and to want to be compassionate and to want to not hurt this person unnecessarily. But think what you're doing to every other woman on the face of the planet when you use his preferred pronouns. You are saying to those women that their bodies and their bodily experiences count for nothing. That's misogyny by default, if not by intention. But are there grounds for hope? Yes. What is very interesting, I think, certainly in the earthly city, a lot of people are waking up to the problem. Strangest talk I had to give in the last year was at the only accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States of America, Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. I was literally across the road from UC Berkeley, Judith Butler's home territory. Her territory was closer to me than that exit is over there. It was rather delicious. And it was kind of fun. It was one of the talks I gave where there was no obvious security, which was nice. And I'm thinking, the safest place for me to operate in Berkeley is in the Muslim enclave. They're not going to tangle with the Muslims. But what really struck me as interesting was the number of conversations I had afterwards with young Muslim mums, terrified about what was going to be done to their kids. Many of these Muslims actually send their children to the local Christian school. I'm encouraged by that. Not encouraged by Islam as such, but I'm encouraged by the fact that A, people are waking up, and B, people are seeing that Christians have an important role to play here. I think we need to think about the body and its telos or its end. You might be saying, so what do I teach my kids? Well, teach your kids to treasure their bodies. And teach your kids to realize that their bodily functions are not problems. They're not bugs in the system. They're actually features of the system. I interviewed the great Abigail Favale, doing wonderful work on gender theory at the University of Notre Dame for my podcast. Kevin, have you had her on your podcast? Wonderful. And I started off by asking her the question. I said, okay, Abby, I'm going to ask you a question that has flummoxed some of the greatest minds of our generation. What is a woman? And without taking a breath, she gave me this 90-second definition. I can boil it down to this. She essentially said, a woman is somebody whose body is tailored towards the end of gestation. And then she went on to qualify it. She said, that is not to say that a woman born without a womb, or a woman born infertile, or a woman who is not married, or a woman who does not have children, or a woman before the age of childbearing or after the age of childbearing is not a woman. It is to say that normatively, a woman is somebody whose body is designed for childbearing. Notice what she's done there. She has flown in the face of 50 years of feminist thinking, which tells us that the woman's body is a problem. We need to teach our children, I would suggest, the theological significance of their bodies. And thirdly, as I've tried to do in a number of points in my talks, both last night and tonight, I think we need to realize that, as I said last night, a lot of this connects to the way we imagine ourselves to be rather than the arguments we've heard. And that can actually play in our favor because intuitions are strong. Intuitions are strong. That's why sex crimes remain heinous, and most people, if not all people, understand that. It is not a social construct to consider rape a heinous crime. It is a violation of the self. A violation of the self. On a different issue, on the issue of abortion, I get my students to think of this thought experiment. Imagine a situation where Robert George, the great professor, great pro-life professor at Princeton University, and Peter Singer, the great pro-euthanasia, pro-infanticide thinker at Princeton University, are walking down Nassau Street late at night, and they hear a baby crying in a doorway, and they look over, and there is a little crib and a newborn baby crying in the doorway. I asked the students, do you think that Robbie George and Peter Singer engage in a debate about what action to take? That Robbie George says, we need to dial 911 and get this baby help, and we need to find the mother and get her help too. And Peter Singer says, oh, no. It's not a person until it's 2 years old. We can leave it here for the cats or the dogs to eat. Of course not. Of course not. There's no debate in those situations. Peter Singer is reaching for the phone to dial 911 as Robbie George is caring for the child, or vice versa. Why? Because a baby's a little body. And face to face with a little body, we react differently to the way we do when we're thinking about abstractions. Bodies are concrete persons, and that plays powerfully to the way we think. So that, as my final point, say this: let's think creatively about the things, the intuitions, not so much the arguments, but the intuitions that human beings have as embodied persons that will allow us to make the case for what the Bible teaches about human personhood, even in our crazy transhumanist, technologized world. Remember, human persons are not technological creations. We are not spooky substances that float around in our bodies. We are embodied persons. And with that as our starting point, I think we stand a chance of educating the rising generation in the correct way about the most pressing and dangerous ideologies of our contemporary moment. Thank you for listening so patiently.